Julian never remembered his father buying anything new for himself. Not a coat when the lining tore, not a phone when his screen shattered into a spiderweb, not even the boots that gave him blisters every time it rained. His father saved like his life depended on it. Every dime, every tip, every late night shift he picked up wasn't for a vacation or some dream car. It was for Julian. And Julian knew that. That's what made the lie so heavy. Robert Hale was the kind of man who didn't say "I love you" out loud. He showed it in packed lunches, in patched jeans, in quietly checking if the heater still worked before his son got home from school. He was a construction laborer by day and a janitor by night, and somehow he still had enough energy to ask Julian if he needed help with homework. He never went to college, barely made it out of high school, but when Julian got accepted into university, it felt like everything he had ever sacrificed was finally worth it. Julian wanted to believe that too. At first, he did. He packed his bags, kissed his father goodbye, and promised, "I'll make you proud." And for a while, he meant it. He attended lectures, took notes, tried. But as the months passed, the weight of expectation and the pressure to live a life that didn't feel like his own started to crack something inside him. Julian was gay. He had known that for years, but he never told his father. Not because he was ashamed, but because he was scared of becoming another disappointment. So instead of telling the truth, he told himself a different story. He would graduate, get a job, make money, come out later when it didn't matter anymore. When he had something to offer first. Something his father could point to and say, "That's my boy." But trying to live a double life came with a cost. And soon Julian started slipping, skipping class, ignoring emails, spending more time with people who didn't care if he passed or failed as long as he showed up to the party. Still, every time his father called, he answered with a smile. "Yeah, school's good. Yeah, I'm doing fine. Yeah, I'm still on track." And Robert believed him. He always did, because he wanted to. Because to Robert, the idea that his son might be struggling, or worse, lying, was too painful to imagine. So he kept saving. Sold his old truck to cover Julian's second-year tuition. Took on extra hours when Julian said he might need to buy books this term. Skipped his own dentist appointment to wire another $300 for lab fees. Julian told himself he'd make it up to him someday. But the thing about lies is that they don't wait. They pile up like unpaid bills, and Julian's were stacking higher than he could manage. He didn't know it yet, but the day everything collapsed was already on its way. And when it came, it wouldn't just cost him his father's trust. It would force him to decide, for the first time in his life, who he really was when there was nothing left to fake. Have you ever told a lie to protect someone, only to realize you were breaking something sacred? Stay with us. Julian's truth catches up with him, and the cost is more than he can pay. Like, comment, and follow Heart Stories, where silence breaks and healing begins. Julian didn't mean to lie forever. He just meant to lie until he got it together, until he could catch up, until he could be the version of himself his father thought he was. But time didn't wait for him to get it right, and neither did the bills. At first, the lies were small, a white lie about a passing grade that was actually an incomplete, a made-up story about a professor who, till he lost his paper, bought him a few extra weeks of pretending. When his father asked about majors and credits, Julian Googled terms he didn't understand and recited them like he knew what he was doing. He convinced himself it was kindness, that sparing his father the worry was an act of love. But as the semesters dragged on, the weight of the performance grew heavier. Julian stopped attending classes altogether. The more he withdrew from school, the more he leaned into distraction. He found comfort in people who didn't ask questions, in nights that blurred into mornings, in music too loud and rooms too dark to think. He drank more. He showed up less. He told himself he was just finding himself, that other people his age were doing the same. Meanwhile, back in Texas, Robert was skipping dinner to stretch the groceries another week. He didn't tell Julian when his knees gave out and he had to wear a brace to work. He didn't say anything when the water heater broke and he showered cold for 2 weeks straight. What mattered to him was that Julian was doing well. Every time he wired tuition, he smiled at the bank teller and said, he's going to be the first Hale to graduate college. He carried that sentence like a medal. Julian knew. He always knew. And that made it worse. He started dreading phone calls. Texts from his dad went unanswered for days. He told his father he was studying late, that his internship kept him busy, that everything was under control. When Robert asked for photos from campus, Julian sent staged ones, borrowed library shots. Him smiling with borrowed textbooks, lies wrapped in lighting filters. His father never questioned it, and still the money came, even when Robert had to sell his old truck, even when he had to ask for an advance from work. He kept showing up for his son, while Julian kept disappearing from himself. Somewhere deep down, Julian thought maybe he could fix it. Maybe if he cleaned up, re-enrolled, and finished strong, it would all balance out. But he wasn't ready, and the truth didn't wait. It arrived in the most mundane way, a billing email. The school had sent countless warnings to Julian's inbox, all unread, but this one, through some error in contact information, went to Robert's phone. Past due notice. 3 semesters unpaid. Suspension pending. Robert read the message in the parking lot of the construction site, hands stained with dust, heart sinking before he could even process the words. That night he called Julian. No anger, no accusation, just a quiet voice asking, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" Julian froze. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. He tried to spin it, say there was a mistake, that he was sorting it out, but his father's silence on the other end said everything. He didn't yell, he didn't beg, he didn't hang up. He just said, "I trusted you all this time, and you never let me know you were drowning." Then he ended the call. Julian stared at his screen long after it went dark. That was the moment he realized the lie wasn't just about school. It wasn't even about being gay. It was about who he had become in the absence of truth. A version of himself so hollow he couldn't even recognize the boy who used to draw constellations on his bedroom ceiling and dream of becoming someone his father would brag about. And then came the final blow. The rent was due. Julian, living in a student apartment his father had paid for all along, no longer had access to the funds. The landlord didn't care about excuses. He gave Julian until the end of the week. Then he changed the locks. Just like that, Julian's double life ended. Not with fire, not with a fight, but with silence and a door that no longer opened. Julian spent his last night in the apartment, sitting on the floor with his back to the wall, watching the blinking red light of the smoke detector reflect off empty water bottles. The room smelled like old takeout and dust. There were no posters on the walls, no framed photos left on the shelves, just silence and the sharp awareness that everything he'd built, every illusion, every cover story had dissolved around him. The landlord didn't slam the door when he handed Julian the eviction notice. He didn't need to. The finality was clear. Julian tried to explain, but the man had heard it all before. Students who ran out of money, kids who burned through chances, people who didn't think the end would actually come until they were standing on the street with nowhere to go. Julian shoved what he could into his backpack, some clothes, a notebook, the cracked phone that barely held a charge, and left the rest behind. For the first time in his life, he was untethered. No plan, no money, no lies left to hide behind. He wandered for hours that first day, circling blocks, lingering in cafes, until someone noticed he wasn't buying anything. At nightfall, he found a bench near a 24-hour laundromat and sat down. It was cold, damp, the kind of chill that slipped under your clothes and settled in your spine. His phone died sometime after midnight. He didn't even notice. He hadn't had anyone to call anyway. That night, as the city hummed and hissed around him, Julian pulled his knees to his chest and stared across the parking lot. A man, late 40s, maybe early 50s, was crouched beside the wall of a convenience store. Beside him sat a little boy, bundled in 2 mismatched jackets and a wool hat too big for his head. The boy looked maybe 6. He kept fidgeting, trying to keep his hands warm, while the man slowly unwrapped something from a napkin. It was a sandwich, not a big one. White bread, maybe peanut butter. The man tore it in half, then tore one half again. He gave the bigger piece to the boy. The smaller piece he looked at for a moment, then slid it into his pocket. The boy asked something. Julian couldn't hear the words, but the man just smiled and pulled the child into his side. They sat like that for minutes, silent, heads leaned together under the glow of a flickering street lamp. Julian turned away, not because he was ashamed of them, but because he was ashamed of himself. He hadn't spoken to his father in 10 days. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't said anything. Because what could he say? What words could unburn the bridge? But watching that man give up his only meal just to keep his son full, Julian felt something in his chest twist, not like guilt, not even like grief. It was closer to grief's quieter cousin. Regret. He had taken that kind of love for granted, had pocketed the sandwich and walked away while someone else went hungry. And suddenly being cold didn't feel like the worst part. Being invisible did. The next morning, Julian woke with his back stiff and his eyes crusted from dried tears he didn't remember crying. His limbs ached from the bench. His stomach was tight with emptiness, but his mind, oddly, was clear. He walked 5 blocks to a community shelter, the kind with flickering lights and mismatched chairs, and asked if they needed help. Not a bed, not food, just something to do, something that made him feel like he still had value, even if it wasn't the kind his father once bragged about. The woman at the desk didn't ask many questions. She handed him a mop and pointed toward the kitchen. He spent the day cleaning counters, stacking soup cans, organizing donations. His hands found a rhythm. His breath, for the first time in weeks, evened out. That night, as he left the shelter, he passed a bulletin board pinned with photos, volunteers, kids, handwritten thank you notes. Tucked in the corner was a faded Polaroid of a young man holding a broom, smiling shyly. Someone had scribbled underneath, "Sometimes you rebuild with less, but you rebuild." Julian stood in front of that photo longer than he meant to. Something about it felt familiar. Not the face, the feeling. It didn't fix anything. His father still wasn't calling. The apartment was still gone. His degree was still non-existent. But for the first time in a long time, Julian felt like he had taken a step, however small, toward being someone real. Not perfect, not proud, but present. And maybe, just maybe, that was a place to begin again. Julian didn't tell anyone what he saw that night. Not the boy, not the sandwich, not the man who quietly chose hunger over letting his child go without. But it lived in him, tucked between the cracks of his ribs, surfacing every time he smelled cheap peanut butter or passed a father holding a child's hand too tightly. The moment hadn't changed his circumstances. He still had no home, still woke stiff and cold beneath awnings and alley covers, still survived on packets of saltine crackers and the kindness of volunteers. But something in him had shifted. He returned to the shelter the next day, not to ask, but to mop. No one questioned why. A few people nodded in recognition. Others didn't notice him at all. Julian didn't care. The work was mundane, sweeping floors, organizing shelves of donated shoes, wiping down counters still sticky from kids' lunches. But it was the first thing in weeks that didn't feel fake. He began keeping a notebook, not of grades or goals, just moments. He wrote down faces, things people said, the way a toddler gaggled when someone dropped a spoon, how a woman gave her last banana to a stranger because he looked like he needed it more. The small kindnesses others did without recognition, the ones Julian had once looked past. He stopped checking his phone for messages that never came, stopped expecting an apology from the world or a second chance he hadn't earned. What he wanted now couldn't be handed to him. It had to be made, like bread from scratch, slowly, with work, with mess, with no guarantee it would rise. One afternoon, while hauling donated boxes from a delivery van, Julian heard someone call out from across the lot. "Hey man, need a hand?" The voice was familiar. He turned. Lucas. They had been roommates for 1 semester during freshman year before Julian started skipping class and partying every night. Lucas had always been the quiet one, the type who kept a plant on the windowsill and listened to jazz when he studied. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Julian had ghosted him when the lies became too big to carry around other people. Lucas didn't ask questions. He just lifted a box and carried it inside. Over the next hour, they moved cartons of canned soup and cereal without saying much. At one point, Julian tried to explain, stumbling over words like "screwed up" and "not who I used to be." Lucas just shrugged. No one is. That night, Lucas offered Julian a couch. Not a room, not a lease, just a couch, temporary, quiet, safe. Julian accepted. The couch was in a tiny apartment above a laundromat that smelled permanently of lavender and detergent. Lucas worked early mornings at a bakery, left sticky notes on the fridge that read things like "drink water" or "you got this." He never pried. Julian kept working at the shelter. He stopped drinking, stopped staying out late, stopped making promises he couldn't keep. One evening, while folding clothes at the donation table, he noticed a familiar man at the back of the line. Older, slouched posture, calloused hands. It was him, the man from that night, the father who had given up his dinner. Julian didn't approach, didn't say anything. He just watched as the man accepted a paper bag of food, ruffled his son's hair, and quietly exited through the same side door. But in his chest, something clicked. Not like a snap, but like a door that had been stuck for years suddenly moving on its hinge. That was love. Not the kind sung about in pop songs or wrapped up in grand gestures, but the kind that shared a sandwich and never asked to be seen. Julian went home that night and opened his notebook. For the first time, he didn't just describe what he saw. He wrote a letter to his father. He didn't beg for forgiveness, didn't explain everything. He just said this: "You gave up everything for me, and I treated it like it was nothing. I lied because I didn't think I deserved your love if you knew who I really was. But now I understand love isn't something I have to earn. It's something you already gave. I don't expect anything back. I just needed to say it. I'm still your son. I just finally know what that means." He didn't mail it. He folded the letter and tucked it between the pages of his notebook. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. Julian didn't expect the letter to change anything. He hadn't even sent it. It sat quietly in his notebook like a confession left at the edge of a bed, meant more for the weight it lifted than the response it might bring. He kept showing up at the shelter, folding donated clothes, wiping counters, taking up space in Lucas's small but steady world. Days passed, then weeks. Life remained quiet. And for once, that felt enough. He was folding jackets one gray morning when someone at the front desk called his name. "There's someone here for you." Julian walked to the lobby slowly, almost cautiously, unsure who could possibly be looking for him. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. Robert. His father stood near the doorway holding a small paper bag. His face was thinner, his jacket older, but his eyes, those quiet, unsentimental eyes, were the same. Julian froze. Every apology he had rehearsed vanished. Robert didn't speak. He reached into the paper bag and pulled out a pair of boots. Julian's old work boots, the ones he had worn for 2 years straight in high school. They had been cleaned, the soles had been repaired, the laces were new. Then he handed over a photo. It was the two of them, standing in front of Julian's old high school on graduation day. Julian's hair was longer then, his smile still unsure. Robert's hand rested lightly on his son's shoulder. The photo had been folded and refolded, its edges soft from time. And then softly he said, "If you're still trying, I'll walk with you this time." That was it. No anger, no lecture, no speech about disappointment or shame, just presence, just love in the only language Robert had ever known, showing up even after silence. Julian didn't cry, but when he put the boots down and looked his father in the eye, there was something raw and honest between them that neither of them had ever dared say out loud. He didn't go back home that night, but the door, the one he thought he'd closed forever, wasn't locked. It never had been. Has someone ever forgiven you without saying a word? If this story touched you, share it with someone who once held the door open when you didn't think you'd be allowed back in. Like, comment, and follow Heart Stories, where silence can speak louder than anything else.